social media pages. On Saturdays between 4 and 5 p.m. in English and French, we offer a compilation of our best features on culture and discovery. Sundays at 4:30 p.m. in English, the week's best heroes and books.
WADR, promoting dialogue. It's May Day in Dakar, 1 o'clock in Cotonou. Good afternoon and many thanks for staying tuned to West Africa, the Democracy Radio broadcasting on 94.9 FM and around the world on WADR.org. Welcome to Newslink, and here are the top stories. Nigeria's military pledges renewed fight against terrorism amid escalating attacks in parts of the country.
This situation is made worse by local collaborators that form a support base for these terrorists. They serve as informants reporting on troops' movement to the terrorists.
Tension surrounds the U.S.-Ghana diplomatic relations over $250 million debt to some American companies. Human Rights Watch World Report 2025 laments government's failure to hold rights violators accountable.
2024 revealed many failures. Governments worldwide were called to act in line with their obligations on human rights, and many failed.
And in Togo, political figures and human rights organizations denounced the arrest of a Saba activist. Please stay tuned for details of these stories and more.
Here is Augustine Coley with Newslink.
Many thanks to our listeners in West Africa and beyond. Newslink begins in Benin, where following an attack by the Group for the Support of Islam and Muslims, JNIM, in the north of the country, the Chief of Staff has called for joint actions against terrorism despite tensions with Niger. Recall that on Wednesday, January 9, around 30 Benin soldiers died in an attack by the JNIM on an army base on the border with Burkina Faso and Niger. But on Thursday, a day after this offensive, General Fructuo Bagidi, Chief of Staff of the Benin's armed forces, called for increased military cooperation within the sub-region. This attack comes in the context of heightening diplomatic tensions between Benin and Niger. The authorities in Niamey accuse Cotonou of collusion with France to destabilize the transition established since the coup d'etat of July 2023. But for Lukman Orucheru, a Benin's investigative journalist on security issues, Benin has an interest in collaborating with its neighbors Burkina Faso and Niger to overcome terrorism.
There is a force patrolling the Gaïa area, the Roche region of Benin, and also across the border with Karimama, which is also a danger zone. If the Beninese state succeeds in convincing neighboring states, it could significantly contribute to the fight against terrorism.
Cela pourra véritablement contribuer à lutter efficacement contre le terrorisme. Et donc, le
Niger, for instance, has some experience and knowledge of the phenomenon that they could share with Benin, which could greatly benefit the Beninese state.
You just heard the voice of Benin's investigative journalist on security issues, Lukman Orucheru. In related terrorism news, the Nigerian military has pledged to intensify efforts to combat terrorism as insurgent activities surge in the northeast of the country, reportedly bolstered by foreign fighters and local collaborators. Major General Edward Buba, spokesperson for the Defense Headquarters, disclosed during a press briefing in Abuja on Thursday that recent attacks in Borno State were linked to the influx of foreign agents from the Sahel region who are strengthening Boko Haram and affiliated groups. Usman Umar tells us more.
General Buba highlighted attacks in areas such as Damboa, Chibok and Goza, where military personnel continue to confront the growing threat. Despite setbacks, he reaffirmed the military's commitment to ensuring the safety and security of Nigerians.
This situation is made worse by local collaborators that form a support base for these terrorists. They serve as informants reporting on troops' movement to the terrorists. However, in spite of this situation, troops are profoundly conscious of their role and responsibility in ending insurgency and terrorism across our nation. Though we might record occasional tactical setbacks, our strategic objective remains unhindered, and it is to break the terrorists' will to fight.
Troops recently faced heavy casualties in an ambush by Boko Haram militants in Baga, near Lake Chad. Reports indicate that the soldiers were ambushed while attempting to retrieve the bodies of 40 civilians killed by the insurgents. The ensuing battle claimed the lives of several soldiers, while an unspecified number remained missing. In a separate incident days earlier, militants linked to the Islamic State group reportedly overran a military base in Borno, killing 6 soldiers in a coordinated assault. The resurgence of violence underscores the evolving challenges facing Nigerian forces as foreign and domestic threats converge to destabilize the region. General Buba emphasized that despite the challenges, the military remains resolute in its mission to dismantle terrorist networks and restore peace. For Newslink on West Africa Democracy Radio, Usman Umar reporting from Abuja.
Meanwhile, the Nigerian Energy Minister Adebayo Adelabu has urged the security forces to step up efforts to protect electricity infrastructure, which has been targeted by increasing vandalism, jeopardizing the national grid. The minister also calls on security agents to redouble their efforts to protect the country's power infrastructure, especially in the face of the growing threats of vandalism. Presenting the ministry's budget before the National Assembly in Abuja, Mr. Adelabu stressed the critical importance of thorough sensitization to combat acts of terrorism that have severely impacted the country's power grid. He highlighted the interconnectedness of the power transmission system, stressing that damage to a single component has widespread repercussions across the entire network. Now, here in Senegal, President Bassirou Diomaye Faye presided over the formal opening of the courts and tribunal on Thursday. The discussions focused on major reforms in the justice system and the supervision of the right to strike. During the discussions, the Senegalese head of state announced legal reforms aimed at classifying the conditions on which this right can be exercised in strategic sectors. However, how can the Senegalese state strengthen social dialogue and the right to strike? Let's hear from Alioune Fall, a Labour and Social Security Inspector and the head of the Negotiations and Professional Relations Division at the Ministry of Work.
We can think that the right to strike and social conflicts can be better regulated, and in this case, we must put the cursor on alternative conflict resolution mechanisms. So, I spoke earlier about conciliation, and among these mechanisms, we have mediation and arbitration. So, arbitration and mediation are two mechanisms that make it possible to avoid social conflicts by proposing alternative conflict resolution mechanisms. I think that we need to move towards what is called strengthening social dialogue. The President of the Republic has proposed a social rebasing, that is, having a much more sophisticated social dialogue mechanism by trying to establish a framework for debate or consultation between social partners. We need to move towards signing a social stability pact, and I think that in this pact we can redefine the contours of our social dialogue system.
Alioune Fall is a Labour and Social Security Inspector and the head of the Negotiations and Professional Relations Division at the Ministry of Work in Senegal.
More stories coming up on West Africa Democracy Radio. Newslink continues.
The State House of the Gambia has announced that Ghana's President John Dramani Mahama will arrive in the country this Friday on a day's working visit. According to a media release, President Adama Barrow will receive the visiting head of state at the Banjul International Airport and later host him at a state luncheon. The two heads of state would then hold discussions about ways to further strengthen the Gambia-Ghana bilateral relations. It must be stated that President Adama Barrow of the Gambia was in Accra on January 7, 2025, during the presidential inauguration of President John Mahama. In the meantime, President Mahama has lamented the escalating threats of terrorism in neighboring countries, underscoring the urgent need for stronger regional cooperation. He made these comments during a high-level meeting in Accra with Mali's Prime Minister General Abdoulaye Maiga, where both leaders reaffirmed their commitments to enhancing security and economic collaboration.
Addressing the media after a meeting aimed at strengthening ties between Ghana and Mali, President Mahama expressed deep concern over the growing threats of terrorism in neighboring countries. He highlighted the pressing need for collaborative efforts to restore stability and ensure regional security.
We note what is happening in the geopolitics of our sub-region and the unfortunate situation that is unfolding in the Sahel. It is not anything that is new, but it continues to become more grave than it was in the past. And I'm talking about the issue of insurgency and terrorism. And as I told Mr. Prime Minister, in Ghana we have a proverb that if your neighbor's house is on fire, you must assist him to quench it. Otherwise, it will, when it finishes burning down his house, it will spread to yours. And so our security is a common objective, and we must work with each other to make sure that our sub-region is safe.
He also noted the decision of the three Sahelian states to exit ECOWAS, but expressed hope that with continuous dialogue, both parties will find a resolution to the matter. Prime Minister Maiga praised President Mahama's leadership, describing it as a renewed hope for Pan-Africanism. He expressed optimism about the two countries enhancing economic and security collaboration.
We conveyed a message from His Excellency General Assimi Goïta, President of the Transition and Head of State of Mali. General Goïta sees President Mahama's leadership as a renewed hope for Pan-Africanism, viewing him as a successor to Presidents Kwame Nkrumah and John Rawlings. He highlighted the historic ties between Mali and Ghana, including the Mali-Ghana-Guinea Union, and expressed confidence in strengthening economic and security cooperation under their leadership.
For WADR, Nadiri Teti, Accra.
Meanwhile, Ghana is reported to be owing several American companies approximately $251 million. This was disclosed by a ranking member of the United States Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, Senator James Rich, who added that the payment of these debts will significantly influence the future relationship between the two countries. Senator Rich urged Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen to leverage America's position as the IMF's largest shareholder to ensure the fund compels Ghana to repay its debts to the American entities, including Twin City Energy, American Tower Company, Chubb, Cosmos Energy, and Ziblin. According to him, these debts place a severe financial burden on the companies and threaten their operations in Ghana. The senator also expressed concern that the IMF's anticipated approval of a $3 billion extended credit facility for Ghana does not account for these debts. Instead, he believes this could set a harmful precedent for other sovereign borrowers and negatively impact U.S. companies operating abroad. You are listening to Newslink here on West Africa Democracy Radio, broadcasting on 94.9 FM Dakar, Senegal. Here is a reminder of the top stories. Nigeria's military pledges renewed fight against terrorism amid escalating attacks in parts of the country. Tension surrounds the U.S.-Ghana diplomatic relations over $250 million debt to some American companies. Human Rights Watch World Report 2025 laments government's failure to hold rights violators accountable. In Togo, political figures and human rights organizations denounced the arrest of Saba activists. Still ahead, we have the guest interview and the sports news, so please stay with us.
Fresh and breaking news all the time. Hear it first as the news breaks, only on West Africa Democracy Radio. Newslink continues.
Man, thanks for staying with us. That's a reminder, we're streaming live on YouTube at WADR News and on Facebook, WADR English Service. Let's take you to Togo, where reactions from political figures and human rights organizations have intensified following the arrest of a cyber activist, Sophie Sokpol, better known online as Aficho, on January 12, 2025. Reports suggest that Sokpol was detained under circumstances resembling a kidnapping, followed by a trap set by the authorities. He was initially held at the National Gendarmerie headquarters in Jojole Lome before being brought before an investigating judge on January 14. Imo Edit has more in this report.
Afexio was transferred to Lome Civil Prison on Wednesday, with his arrest garnering significant attention due to accusations that he incited civil disobedience through his online posts. Among these was a poem titled Fate Apart, Do Your Part, in which Sokpol criticized government oppression in the country while calling for collective actions to challenge the political system, which he describes as unjust. But this arrest has attracted strong reactions from civil society organizations, CSOs. In a joint statement signed by over 10 organizations, they demanded Sokpol's immediate release, calling his detention unjust and illegal. The CSOs emphasized that his arrest was not just an attack on his personal rights, but also on the fundamental freedoms of all Togolese citizens. Their statement said, and I quote, "We call for the immediate and unconditional release of Mr. Sisokwe Sokpol Honore, the human rights activist who has been arbitrarily arrested and detained." End of quote. The organizations also expressed concern about the violence that accompanied Sokpol's arrest and the broad implications for freedom of speech in Togo, while denouncing the role of the judiciary, particularly the prosecutor and the investigating judge in Lome, accusing them of acting as instruments of the political regime. Meanwhile, the opposition party Lome, Dynamique pour la Majorité du Peuple, DMP, has also quickly condemned Sokpol's arrest, labeling it as arbitrary and a direct violation of human rights.
Imo Edit with that report. Also in Togo, the trial in the Trading Gate case, a large-scale alleged fraud operation, has been postponed to February 13 this year. The trial initially began on January 15 in Lomé. Many victims attended, seeking reimbursement of their capital. Tisu explains the details in this report filed by Mamadou Ramata Jallo in Lomé.
The case dates back to 2021. Several trading company officials have been in custody since then. The Togolese justice system accuses them of illegal activities. They are charged with involvement in a large-scale fraud operation that has affected thousands of savers and investors, with estimated damages amounting to several billion CFA francs. 13 individuals, mostly officials of illegal investment companies in Togo or their collaborators, are in the dock, while 20 others remain at large. On the day of the trial, the victims appeared seeking reimbursement of their capital and potential compensation. According to the president of the Victims Collective, her organization alone represents 3,000 people who have lost 5 billion CFA francs. In 2021, the victims, including workers, civil servants, executives, and military personnel, believed in promises of returns of 50%, 100%, or even 300% after depositing a certain amount of money. Today, according to the Victims Collective, many of them have become ill, indebted, or separated due to lack of money.
That was Mamadou Ramata Jallo's report, voiced by Tisu. Meanwhile, the U.S. trial of accused Liberian warlord Lai Sekou Kamara, alias K1 or Dragon Master, has been called off after he pleaded guilty to criminal immigration fraud charges. A former commander of a rebel group, Mr. Kamara, 46, was due to go on trial on January 21 in a U.S. district court in the state of Philadelphia on a range of charges, including lying that he had never served in or been a member of a rebel group or insurgent organization. All 17 Liberian witnesses against him are currently in the U.S., having flown from Liberia, but they will not get a chance to testify against him for his war-related crimes, which he has admitted to committing. His action now leaves the judge with the only option of sentencing him, an action expected to be taken in May this year. Elsewhere, the Human Rights Watch on Thursday released its World Report 2025, which highlights global human rights violations and related issues. The report, titled A Year of Reckoning, examines the human rights situation in over 100 countries from the past. Christopher Teacher reports.
The World Report 2025 highlights the double standards of Western democracies in response to global human rights violations, while simultaneously supporting authoritarian regimes. It identifies numerous failures of governments to address human rights issues, although some countries are making efforts to ensure accountability for these violations. Tirana Hassan is the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch.
2024 revealed many failures, but it actually also saw inspiring acts of resilience in defense of human rights. Governments worldwide were called to act in line with their obligations on human rights, democracy, and humanitarian action, and many failed. In China, Russia, and Venezuela, repression actually intensified. The conflicts in Gaza, Sudan, and Ukraine brought devastating human costs, again showing how fragile international norms are when they are not backed up by political will.
The Executive Director of Human Rights Watch also advocates for civil society organizations and the media to intensify their efforts in upholding government accountable for the well-being of their citizens.
The vital role of civil society and journalists in holding truth to power and to make governments accountable to the people that they're supposed to serve. Protecting freedom of expression and independent media remains a priority, even as authoritarian regimes work to silence dissent under all of their regimes. In country after country, we see defenders and organizations who are pushing back against unchecked power of real and want-to-be autocrats being shut down, disappeared, surveilled, and arrested.
Human Rights Watch HRW is a non-governmental organization that investigates and reports on human rights violations, advocating for change with governments, businesses, and armed groups worldwide. Each year, the organization publishes its World Report, which highlights both failures and successes of government in protecting human rights globally.
Christopher Teacher reporting there.
Politics, analysis on major news, social matters, and all. This is A Guest.
This segment of Newslink focuses on discussions about major reforms in the justice system of Senegal and the supervision of the right to strike. On yesterday, Thursday, Senegalese President Bassirou Diomaye Faye presided over the formal opening of the courts and tribunals. During the discussion, the Senegalese head of state announced legal reforms aimed at classifying the conditions under which this right can be exercised in strategic sectors. Our guest is Alion Fa, a Labor and Social Security Inspector and the head of the Negotiations and Professionals Relations Division at the Ministry of Work in Senegal.
Je pense que le président de la République a plutôt rappelé.
I think that the President of the Republic rather recalled that the right to strike is regulated in Senegal. The right to strike is not only regulated, but there are mechanisms that have been put in place by the regulations to find alternatives to conflict. I will give an example. First, before issuing a strike order, the regulations require that certain procedures be respected. So, these procedures that allow conflict to be resolved before strikes. So, there is a mechanism for preventing conflict in the first instance, and now, if this prevention is not possible, it is at this point that the strike can be a tool for organizing the showdown between the employer and the worker. So, what we need to remember is that under the Labor Code, if a group of people, unions or staff representatives decide to go on strike or notice a conflict, they must first inform the labor inspector or the general director of labor and social security. The latter tries to play good officers tries to reconcile the parties. If a solution is not found following this attempt at reconciliation, workers who notice a business problem can, in this case, file a 30 days strike notice. So, at the end of these 30 days, if no solution is found, at this time, we can only declare that we can say that the strike is lawful. Now, as the President of the Republic said, the strike must not prevent the community of certain services, especially if they are basic social services.
Continuité de certains services, surtout si c'est des services sociaux de base.
The Senegalese head of state also spoke out on the reform of the labor code. How can we ensure that all stakeholders are satisfied once these reforms have been made?
Oui, je pense que le président faisait allusion.
Yes, I think that the president was referring to the reforms of the labor code that is underway because, as you know, you think that the right to strike and social conflict can be better regulated, and in this case, we must focus on alternative conflict resolution mechanisms. So, I speak earlier about reconciliation, and among these mechanisms, we have mediation and arbitration. Arbitration and mediation are two mechanisms that make it possible to avoid social conflict by proposing alternatives conflict resolution mechanisms. And I think that these are mechanisms that will be at the forefront of the reform of the labor code. Social dialogue will be initiated between employers, workers, and the Senegalese state, which Bassirou Diomaye Faye announced when we know that this framework for dialogue has always existed, but despite this, disputes between parties are still a reality.
Ce sont des mécanismes qui seront en vedette dans le cadre de la réforme du Code du travail.
In your opinion, what new things need to be brought in to solve the problems?
Je pense qu'il faut qu'on se dirige vers ce qu'on appelle le renforcement du dialogue social.
I think we need to move towards what is called strengthening social dialogue. The President of the Republic proposed a social rebasing, i.e., having a much more sophisticated social dialogue mechanism by trying to establish a framework for debate or consultation between the social partners. We need to move towards signing a social stability pact, and I think that in this part, we can redefine the contours of our social dialogue system.
Je pense que dans ce pacte-là, on peut redéfinir les contours de notre système de dialogue social.
He also mentioned solutions such as strengthening mediation and arbitration mechanisms, points that you raised earlier. Are these points on their own enough to guarantee stability in the labor sector?
Alors, la stabilité dans le secteur du travail, c'est...
So stability in the labor system is at least two things. The first is to try to do everything possible to ensure that the regulations are respected so that there are already laws that are effective and that there is a labor administration that has the necessary powers to try to ensure compliance with the law. That is the first thing. The second thing is now, even if we have a labor law, we have a labor inspection. Nevertheless, there will come a day when someone will violate the law. And in this case, what should we do? Should we go to contention? Maybe. But before going to contention, we must propose mechanisms that can bring two parties together, try to find a gentle solution, an alternative solution to the conflict.
Une solution douce, une solution alternative au conflit.
And this last question, Leon Farr, what will be the responsibility of the unions in a contest where the president wants to better regulate the right to strike?
Oui, ils ont une très grande responsabilité dans ça parce que...
Yes, they have a very great responsibility in this because there is an outstretched hand from the authorities. So, I think that no one has an interest in going on strike. No one has an interest in having the social front deteriorate. So, it is important for everyone to know that if we go as far as to decree a strike moderate, it is because all the parties, no one got what they wanted. So, I think that this is an important element that we need to know, and that prosperity must be based on social stability. Now, the parties must reach their numbers, and that will allow each side to see their concerns taken into account.
Je vous remercie, Alioune Fall.
That was Leon Farr, the Labour and Social Security Inspector and head of the Negotiations and Professional Relations Division at the Ministry of Work in Senegal. And in the world of sports, the FIFA Under 17 Women's World Cup qualifiers officially get underway for African teams on Friday. A total of 4 nations will join tournament host Morocco to make up the 5 African representatives to fly the African flag at the finals, set to take place from 17 October to 8 November 2025. And that's how we conclude this edition of Newslink here on West Africa Democracy Radio, broadcasting from Dakar, Senegal. Many thanks to you, and special thanks to Mustafa Sek and Shekin Jai for the technical support. I am Augustine Cully. Good afternoon.
And many thanks to you for listening to Newslink via Hot 104.3 FM, New Me FM 94.